Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at thechangeleader.com. This episode of Changing Higher Ed is sponsored by Perdea Education, a national leader in online student recruitment and enrollment services, providing institutions enrolled students risk-free on a performance-based model with no long-term contract. If your online programs could benefit from incremental online student enrollments, visit PerdeaEducation.com. That's P-E-R-D-I-A education.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Ken Knueven, Senior Program Officer for Higher Education Innovation at the Charles Koch Foundation. Prior to the Koch Foundation, Ken was the Managing Director of AGB Consulting, where he provided strategic direction and leadership for its consulting services organization. Ken leads a portfolio of grant-making initiatives that engage with a wide variety of social entrepreneurs and stakeholders in higher education, developing strong champions, fostering ideas and coalitions, and creating the environments that ensure all students can succeed in college, in their careers, and in life. Ken joins us today to discuss what grantmakers are looking for when it comes to higher education innovation. Well, Ken, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Drumm. It's great to be here as well.
So, you and I go back a ways through our AGB time. Now you are a senior program director at the Charles Koch Foundation. You're doing some incredible things there at Koch. What's going on?
Well, for me, it's the perfect job. My interests have always been technology, if you look at my career, innovation in terms of the kinds of consulting I've always been involved in, and higher ed, which is an industry, if we'll call it that I've been involved in for close to 15 years now. And so where those three circles intersect, if you were to look at it as a Venn diagram, that's a sweet spot for me that I just get great joy. The Charles Koch Foundation allows me to focus on that intersection point. And so I've been here only a short period of time. I'm in my third month now, but I can't tell you how much fun I've had just over this short period of time in terms of looking at innovation in the post-secondary higher education space, looking how technology is being utilized, looking at the innovators, and looking at the impact that it's having positively. Yes, one could look at it negatively, but I look at it as positively in the higher education space, the traditional higher education space in particular. It's just been magnificent. Working with a lot of great innovators out there, some people we know, some people you don't know yet, but you will, and looking to help out these entrepreneurs. We'll call them social entrepreneurs, helping these innovative individuals and groups within traditional higher education spaces. It's just been a fantastic ride so far.
Well, knowing you as I do, this has got to be a complete joy. Like you say, it's the meeting of the Venn diagram, and you've been involved with higher ed, you've been involved with technology. You couldn't have been given more of a dream job, I don't think.
When I started my career, it was in the high-tech arena, and I'm dating myself. I was using technologies that most people today wouldn't know they existed at the time. But I have seen disruption probably, well, like yourself, because it's the age on our faces that shows. But
thanks a lot.
We've seen what technology has done to society over, let's just look at what technology has done. I was going to say, look at what technology has done over the last 40 years, but let's just look at what it's done over the last 20 years to our traditional industries. And I was in the middle of that. Every day was a new day. And then taking that into the higher education space, I would have never thought, when I started my career, I'd be where I'm at today. It would have never come to me. But you know what? That goes to the story for our conversation today. Learning is a lifelong journey. And so you should be able to say, I don't know what's around the next corner, but I'd like to be prepared for it, or as importantly, if it meets me head on, I need to be able to address it and deal with it and succeed with it. And that's what learning should be all about.
And it should be, and when done right, it instills in students that desire for lifelong learning.
Absolutely. To me, a student is anybody from 5 years, maybe younger, to the day they die. I hate to be so morbid about it, but you should be looking. If you're in your 90s like my father, he was still reading, learning, doing everything he could to stay abreast of things, including the disruption of technology, because he knew he was going to get that from me every day.
Well, it reminds me of a saying of a good friend and client of mine: keep living till you die.
Absolutely. And learning is a key component of that.
Absolutely. And so, speaking of learning, higher education is in major transformation. Technology is certainly part of it, but there's a lot of headwinds going on out there.
There are. I may be repeating what is being written about and talked about a lot, but I think it's worthy of at least listening hard or looking at these changes, these headwinds as you call them, on a regular basis, because we have to accept them. If you look at higher education as an industry, and let's just look at the consumers, the learners out there are probably close to 50 million consumers out there that have $1.7 trillion in student debt. That's just unheard of. When we look at what the mortgage industry collapse that caused the Great Recession, I believe the derivatives outstanding in terms of the debt load outstanding through all of that fiasco was less than $1.7 trillion. This is an industry, I hate to be harsh, but my friends at AGB and ACE and everybody else, all of the experts agree, more times than not, we can look at this industry as an industry with poor quality of earnings. We've seen 9 consecutive years of enrollment decline on a national basis, leading to net or lower net tuition pricing. Hopefully everybody knows what net tuition pricing means. There is excess capacity of brick and mortar colleges versus student demand today. Now, COVID had an impact on that, but I don't think that's going to change significantly as we start rolling back to our new normal. And if you look at it from the standpoint of just how the Department of Education tracks things with their metrics, there are more than 1,200 colleges that are either approaching the not financially viable status or worse, according to, as I say, the Department of Education. If you look at it from a consumer behavior standpoint, it's changing significantly. The consumers, the adult learners down to the high school graduates and their families are questioning the approach to take. And the migration from traditional degrees towards certificates and credentials is growing significantly. The corporate workforce development influence, I think, is having a dramatic impact on the traditional higher education model. And technology requirements, if we just look, as I say, where we started this conversation, technology, as it has disrupted every other industry, is having a huge impact in higher education right now. And if you look at it just from, let's call it the new entrant standpoint, new players coming into the post-secondary space, it is putting some competitive pressure on the traditional higher education model. And right now, you're looking at an economic model that I just don't believe supports a continuous investment in functional areas that are critical to any institution's long-term success. So, yeah, those are the headwinds, and it sounds painful. It's almost like looking at this. If you were to put this on a slide, it's a sort of poisonous slide to see. But I think these are things we have to address and admit that they exist.
Absolutely. Now, one of the things that's very telling, and when you and I spoke a week or so ago, even MSNBC came out and they are questioning the value of higher education. Now, that's a mainstream liberal outlet.
Yep. I would agree with that. It's, well, again, it has nothing to do with ideology. If you live in the United States and you want to learn, you should have the ability to learn. You should have access to those capabilities, those offerings, and it should not be limited in any way. But if you look at it from that MSNBC interview to a multitude of articles that have been written about this for years now, corporations have been basically saying, employers, let's look at it from that perspective, in general have been saying, there is value in the degree, but we're starting to question just how much. And I think you look at some great examples that I even think were brought out in that interview. Look at Google as a great example. I worked at Microsoft for nearly 8 years, so Google was a competitor of ours. But if you look at that space, if you look at Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Salesforce, we can go on and on. They are offering certificates and credentials. And Microsoft and most of these entities have been doing this for years, basically saying these certificates and credentials have great value. Now Google has gone so far to boldly say in print and on the air that 2 of their certificates, maybe 3 now, are worth more to them than a 4-year degree. And by the way, they go further and say, and these 150 corporate partners of ours agree with us. That's a hell of a statement, and that is a big shot across the bow.
Oh, it certainly is. Now, there was an interesting study that just came out from AAC&U surveying employers, and what they found was at least half of the employers view the skills of a liberal education, not liberal arts, but liberal education, as very important. You know, the ability to work in teams, critical thinking, ability to analyze, interpret data, all of the things that you would expect a graduate to have. The only problem is higher ed isn't necessarily teaching those things.
Well, as you probably know, I worked at AGB, the Association of Governing Boards, Universities and Colleges, for close to 6 years as a consultant. And then I managed their consulting practice, which was a significant practice area for them. And so I had an opportunity to work with institutions, large and small, public and private, across the country. I always, and still believe today, there is great value in the tradition of the liberal arts degree. I think, as Brandon Bastida said, it just has a branding issue because the qualities are there. As a former employer and one that hired people directly, had hiring managers that hired people directly, we were always looking for people with the critical skills to be able to read, write, articulate, self-confidence, etc. Colleges and universities do that extremely well. And when you can add to that specific skills or competencies on top of that, that's the match made in heaven. And what employers have been saying for years, the IBM study, the OECD study, we can go on and on, employers actually believe that the end product of what you're sending us is good, but it's not great. Interestingly, when you look at it from the student perspective, or sometimes from the leadership perspective within these universities, they look at it and say, we actually think we are doing a good job in providing good quality. So there is a real, how should I say, mismatch in opinions or reality in terms of the quality of the individual that's coming out of that degree program, whatever it might be. And until you sort of satisfy or resolve that mismatch, there is going to be an issue. But right now, yes, employers are facing a shortage of competent individuals, skills, what have you. We read about that all the time. And at the same time, we have institutions that are being very selective about who they recruit through the application process, the admissions process, what have you. So again, there are a lot of mismatches taking place here in terms of what the community as a whole would like to see. When we think of the community as a whole, it's the employers, it's the families, it's the student itself or herself. Until we can align all of those things, I believe we're going to have these conversations over and over, Drumm.
I fully agree. And, you know, there's a lot of folks there have been 3 support packages, bailout packages, whatever you call them, depending on your political leaning. But there have been 3 packages that have gone through Congress, been signed by the president, that have helped support higher ed. Many institutions are using these federal grants to go back to normal, but there is going to be no normal as we used to know it. It's going to be evolving, wouldn't you say?
I would agree, absolutely. The pandemic, I think, has released a new way of thinking about how we work and how we learn and, well, how we interact in society. Just look at what we're doing right now. And so, yes, if there is an individual out there that believes we're going to go back to the way it was a year and a half ago, I'm not a betting man very often, but I would definitely like to play a poker game with that individual for a little while.
Yeah. Can you spell dinosaur?
Yeah, it's one of the biggest issues I see, and this is traditional. This is not unique to the higher education space. But when you look at it from a leadership standpoint, and let's include the board of trustees, a status quo attitude or a status quo or revert to mean approach is not a good strategy, and it will not allow an institution to thrive. And I would throw into that status quo attitude that, hey, we're going to go back to the way it was. I think there are many shareholders and many former board members at Sears and Roebuck or at Blockbuster Video. We can go on and pick out the great examples of that status quo mentality that says we're okay. It's going to be fine. Because you know what? We're in a world of constant disruption, and you can't go through life that way, especially running a business or leading and running and managing an enterprise like a higher education institution.
Well, with all the changes that are going on, there's got to be something, and when we talked about it, you called them North Stars. North Stars that every higher ed institution should be striving for. What are those?
These have always been my beliefs. I think an individual should have an individualized pathway to learning. I don't think one-size-fits-all prescription works anymore, certainly not in the 21st century. And when I consulted with institutions, and again, I was not trying to be harsh or what have you, but I needed to reiterate that, look, we're using an 18th century model of learning, utilizing 20th century business models. And I don't know if anybody's noticed, but we're 20 years or 2 decades into the 21st century.
Really?
Yeah. Hopefully people have noticed that. We have to become more innovative. And in that innovative area, I think we have to recognize the one-size-fits-all path doesn't work anymore. How many unemployed individuals now, because of the pandemic, are still there? Well, let's look at it a different way. There are close to, 70 million individuals out there that have a high school degree and or maybe a partial credit portfolio that they've gone to maybe college a little bit. 70 million, if the number is correct. That one-size-fits-all approach is not satisfying those individuals. And so whether you're a policymaker, a higher education institution leader, or a social entrepreneur, you're a parent, what's wrong with that model? And so there has to be a way to break down that one-size-fits-all barrier and say, look, learning is an individual pathway, and here's how you can do that. And here's how easy it is. And by the way, how affordable is it? So the North Stars for me are, and for where I work as well, would be access to post-secondary education learning, no matter who you are, how old you are, how much you can afford, how much you cannot afford. You should have a pathway available to you. The quality of education should be there and available and measurable and agreed upon. And selectivity should be thrown out the door. And I think we're reading enough about it, so I won't harp on it. But institutions that are proud of their selectivity are going to be disrupted by entities like Arizona State University, Southern New Hampshire University, Western Governors University. We can go on and on about those universities saying, no, we agree, Ken, accessibility for everybody is our North Star, and we will find a way to make that happen. Those are innovators. Every institution leader can do the same thing. And by the way, there are a number of social entrepreneurs out there that are saying, and we can do this too. If you look at the successes of Coursera, SkillUp, we can go on and on, edX, just different mechanisms. Do we need to go further with these approaches? Absolutely. But I consider these sort of the disruptors or the transformational enablers that are coming onto the scene and saying, and basically the outcome is, those that were thinking about the status quo might want to keep their eye open on this, because this is going to be rather intriguing. And so it boils down to our culture. How do we want to address these?
Okay, so we're talking about North Stars: affordability, accessibility, quality. Those are the key North Stars.
Yeah, because as I said, the one size fits all model, I think is not a viable strategy anymore. And I think this is true through K through 12 as well. I mean, I'm just talking about learning in general, but we have to start thinking about individual learning pathways. And I think in the post-secondary space, I think this is where we can have, and we are seeing a lot of interesting things taking place right now.
Well, there was a great talk Chronicle of Higher Ed had their, I don't know if you call it an annual conference, but they had a talk last week, and Michael Crow was talking about this same very thing. He is one of these innovators in higher ed. He, Paul LeBlanc at SNU, and then the president there at Western Governors. They're really shaking up things, as is Google and Microsoft and other things. There's major disruption going on.
I agree. We work closely with Michael, with President Pulsifer at Western Governors, just to name a few. And we're not the only ones. I think, look at how industry is responding to, say, Michael Crow's efforts. Look at my alum at Google, at Microsoft, at Salesforce. Look who attends their ASU JSV conference every year as major supporters of their initiatives. Michael and his team get this, but he's not the only one. There are many out there that are saying the same thing. And that's why I think you will see that the traditional higher education model, while that needs to be broken down and put back together, the institutions have the opportunity to thrive. They just have to recognize that they will have to transform. And I think a good example of this is what Michael is doing. But he's not the only one. And again, not everybody, I think Michael will even tell you, not everybody will attend my institution. That's okay. There are other pathways. There are other ways to get to where you need to be. If you're 50 and just lost your position because the industry has collapsed on you or what have you, there should be pathways available to you to regroup and get back on your feet and go again. It should be easy to access. It should be affordable. The quality of what it is that you're taking on should be there and viable for you. And we're starting to see some good examples there.
Well, it's interesting because as you talk about this, it brings to mind, I believe it's Sweden, one of the Scandinavian countries. I saw an interview a couple of years ago about someone who had lost their job. And they were very frank about it. And they said, hey, losing my job, it's not a big deal because I know I'm going to be retrained in something, new technology, whatever, and the government's going to come in and help me get that. So I will be fine and I'll actually be better off. Now, we don't have that type of solution here in the U.S. And I'm wondering, what is the role in higher education? It means, you lose your job, so your income is at jeopardy. Your life, your housing, all of that stuff is in jeopardy. And you're still expected to pay out more money to retrain yourself. Something doesn't work there for me with that.
Well, again, this goes across a lot of different bounds. This is a policy issue. It is a leadership issue within the traditional higher education space. And when push comes to shove, if you leave it to the disruptors and the innovators out there, you'll see what happens. But yeah, in this country, what is it? We still have probably close to 10 million unemployed because of the pandemic. But I go back to the larger number. You have close to 70 million, maybe more, that have a high school degree or maybe have a little bit or a few credits from a community college or a four-year institution, what have you. What are we doing to address that gap with that many people? So it goes back to my point. If you're a policymaker, a leader within higher education, an influencer, an entrepreneur, what have you, you're focusing on those people. And I will also go back to one of the North Stars that I think is very, very critical here, affordability. Let's not forget the traditional model here, which has to be broken down. Putting people into more and more debt, especially a high school graduate and or that family, it just doesn't make sense anymore. And then as a citizen, when we're dealing with $1.7 trillion in debt that is backed by the government, thank goodness, one has to start to realize, is that a viable model to go forward with? And again, you and I won't solve this, but other countries are doing perhaps a better job of addressing this, but I think this country has the opportunity to do it the best. It's just a matter of whether we want to focus our time and attention on it. But here's the neat thing. These social entrepreneurs that are out there, they are starting to shake things up, and let's throw into that mix people like Michael Crow and others. They'll get us there. It's inevitable, because look at any other industry that has gone through a transformation and continues to go through a transformation. It happens. It's one of the things we do best. Sometimes it's painful, but it does happen. Mm-hmm. Pick an industry, Drumm. You know it as well as I. You focus on strategic planning. How many organizations have you gone into where they're addressing the next 5 to 10 years? And what are the key questions you ask them? You know, it's not as much about what you're thinking about internally, but let's just look at the external environment for a minute and see where you fit and what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the critical question, is what is the external environment doing? Because we don't change for change's sake. Nobody, frankly, everyone says, oh, I love change. Nobody likes change.
No, it's a 4-letter word, even though it's not.
Exactly. And so the external environment drives a lot of these changes. That's what we've seen. COVID is accelerating needed changes in higher education by a decade or more. Gordon Gee. I'm not going to steal his words, but he's a very wise man, as we all know. So what can university presidents do to ensure they stay viable going forward?
Well, not to get too technical, but obviously I think every institution is focusing on their costs. And managing costs, I think, is important, if not critical. But I think one has to realize, and I think you would agree, cost-cutting per se is not a strategy. And it will never, ever, let me repeat, cost-cutting does not lead to prosperity by itself. Mm-hmm. But yes, costs do need to be managed during these tough times. But you have to look at the bigger issues we started this conversation with. And what are you doing to address the decline in enrollment? What are you doing to address how you're dealing with those 70 million interested parties out there? So what are you doing to focus on perhaps changing your model, which means you're probably looking at different revenue streams, possibly for the very first time? But that's, if we go into put our planning hats on, Drumm, and you and I agreed to disagree in certain areas of planning, what have you, but when you put that hat on, you're looking at what are the viable streams of revenue that I might be able to take on? Where would I be investing right now if I had that opportunity? I will tell you right now, technology is going to be one of the key disruptors. So if you're not learning how to embrace technology as an enabler, you better start to, because your competitors, if I may be so abrupt, the other institutions in your area, in your region, in your state, let's go as far as globally, could consume you because they are addressing it and using it as a very powerful enabler. And I think it's looking at your audience differently and looking at your consumers differently. And I think one way to address it is to say, if you're still focusing on the traditional ranking models and what have you in terms of how accessible or how unaccessible you are or inaccessible you are, that's an issue. And so those are probably the key areas I would focus on. But I think for any leader right now has to embrace technology and then, as importantly, see what possible revenue models that they could take on that they weren't thinking about in the past. Or perhaps they were, but now would be the time to dust off that old plan and say, what could we do to become a global online campus? What could we do to leverage the traditional merits of liberal arts education, but with specific competencies and skills? What can we do to partner with the entities like Google and Microsoft and others out there? What can we do to partner with the local economic development community that is embracing keeping the university in town? What are you doing there? And perhaps you're doing well in certain areas. That's great. But if you're not in others, this is the time to address it.
Well, unfortunately, we're coming toward the end of our time. I think you just gave us probably 5 different takeaways for university presidents, so thank you. But just to kind of summarize, What are those takeaways again?
Well, I think the key one that probably consumes the most, it's, and I think you've heard me say this before, Drumm, technology. That is really critical. And that's just not because I worked in the space for so many years. I worked in the space and recognized how disruptive it is. And just look at what it's done to every other industry. And to think that our status quo mindset in higher education says, we're embracing it, or don't worry, that's not a strategy. And that's a very bad tactic to take. The rest follows suit. So I would be leading with, if you're not learning to embrace technology as an enabler, this would be a good time to start.
So you said technology. Those are three takeaways right there, aren't they?
Those are the three top ones for me.
Very good. So, Ken, what's next for you and the Charles Koch Foundation?
Well, as I said, as a senior program officer, I'm what is known as an impact investor, and I'm looking to invest in those innovators, those innovative institutions, those social entrepreneurs that are out there, and there are many good examples already, that are looking to lead in this 21st century with new ideas that are impactful, that have long legs to them. That means the initiative has longevity, that it's repeatable, and the impact only gets better and bigger as each year goes by. So for us, the North Star, my North Star, has always been focused, and I've continued to focus on those social entrepreneurs that focus on what I think are critical: accessibility for everybody, affordability, and quality, both in terms of how we look at the student as well as how the student looks at the programming.
Those are great things. Can you give an example of someone that you've made an investment in and how that's impacted so that presidents will understand what you mean by that?
I think one area that you could look at, and it sort of came out of the pandemic area, but one good example, and I would just suggest, just Google SkillUp. It's a great organization. It's a great partnership of many organizations in terms of addressing those 70 million individuals out there, and specifically those many millions that are still unemployed or underemployed during this pandemic. It demonstrates everything around social entrepreneurship in the post-secondary education space. It focuses on accessibility, it focuses on affordability, and it focuses on an individualized learning pathway. Those are the North Stars that I think SkillUp recognizes and are great examples.
That's great. Well, thank you. Well, Ken, it's been great having you on the show, great reconnecting with you again, and I want to thank you so much.
My pleasure, Drew. It's good to see you again.
Thanks for listening this week, and a special thank you to this week's special guest, Ken Knueven, Senior Program Director at the Charles Koch Foundation, and for his sharing with us his insights on what grantmakers such as the Koch Foundation are looking for when it comes to higher education innovation. I also want to give a special shout out to our sponsor, Perdea Education. Visit PerdeaEducation.com to learn how they can help grow your online student enrollment through a performance-based model with no risk or long-term contracts to your institutions.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at ChangingHigherEd.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@ChangingHigherEd.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.